Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Winston parked his car in front of the humble building where he lived with Veronica after yet another draining workday. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange, but he barely registered the beauty around him. His weariness showed in his slumped shoulders, and his mind was overcrowded with figures, reports, and looming deadlines. He had been giving his all to secure the long-awaited promotion, convinced that it would be beneficial for both of them. Veronica frequently talked about leaving her stressful job as an administrative assistant and possibly starting a family. That was the mutual dream that had bonded them since the day they decided to get married. When he opened the door, Winston was greeted by the aroma of something baking in the oven. Veronica was in the kitchen, her hair tied up in a slightly messy bun and wearing the apron he had given her on their last wedding anniversary. "Hey, honey," she said, not even glancing away from the oven, as though cooking were her way of decompressing after a hectic day. He smiled, feeling that this simple moment made all of his sacrifices worthwhile. Still, something weighed on him inside. It wasn't just tiredness or work stress. It was that bothersome sensation of being there physically but feeling distant at the same time. In recent months, Winston had been spending more hours at the office than at home. His conversations with Veronica were quick and to the point, and the time they shared seemed more like pauses between individual responsibilities than genuine moments of closeness. He noticed that while he collapsed on the couch with a long sigh, Veronica often checked her phone, chuckling at messages he never asked about. "Are you all right?" Veronica asked, placing a plate on the table. He nodded, forcing a grin. "Just exhausted." That had become his standard response, but deep down, he worried he was letting her down without knowing exactly how. Meanwhile, Veronica seemed to have an energy Winston couldn't keep up with. She frequently told amusing stories about work, many involving Clifford, a new colleague who, according to her, had a sharp sense of humor. Winston listened passively, trying to focus on dinner or the next day's tasks. He wanted to believe his dedication at the office would make up for these gaps in their relationship, but part of him knew something needed to change. One night, while washing the dishes after dinner, he noticed Veronica smiling yet again at her phone. "Who is it?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. Veronica just laughed. "It's my work group. They're planning the year-end party." Winston muttered something in response but couldn't shake the tightness in his chest. Maybe it was just paranoia. After all, Veronica was outgoing and always attracted attention. He'd known that since the day he met her. But Winston's job was more than a mere distraction, it represented his commitment. He believed that by finally landing the promotion, he'd give Veronica the security she'd always wanted, so she wouldn't have to put up with work stress, annoying coworkers, or extra hours. He imagined the moment he'd surprise her with the news, picturing her smile when she realized she could finally quit everything and start the new chapter they'd always envisioned, a bigger house, a nursery in the adjacent room, maybe even a dog running around in the yard. Still, while Winston worked tirelessly for that future, he failed to notice he was drifting away from the present. Simple moments like having dinner or chatting about the day no longer had the same warmth. Veronica seemed more distant, but he blamed it on her workload. He saw it as a small price to pay. Winston preferred to believe that in the end, it would all be worth it. That night, as Veronica got ready for bed, he watched her for a few moments. She appeared serene, but there was a certain remoteness in her gaze he couldn't decipher. He wondered if she was as happy as he liked to think she was. "Good night," she said, switching off the bedside lamp. Winston remained silent for a moment before replying. "Good night," he murmured, his heart still heavy even though he couldn't pinpoint the exact reason. Something about that stillness bothered him deeply. The year-end party arrived, and Winston found himself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with a small sigh of unease. He wasn't a big fan of social events, especially when they involved people he barely knew, but Veronica had insisted so much that he finally gave in. "It's going to be fun," she'd said, smiling excitedly as she got ready in the bedroom. Winston knew that despite his reluctance, making small compromises like this was part of a healthy marriage. He also wanted to be more present in Veronica's life, something he felt he had neglected. When they arrived, Winston was instantly impressed by the vibrant atmosphere, colorful lights blinking to upbeat music, servers walking around with trays of champagne, and a live band playing classic holiday tunes. Veronica was glowing. She wore a gorgeous red dress that brought out her natural beauty, and her eyes sparkled with an energy Winston hadn't seen in a while. He couldn't help but smile at how happy she looked, but at the same time, a vague uneasiness clung to him, a feeling he couldn't quite name that weighed on his chest. Veronica was quickly greeted by co-workers, introducing Winston in a casual manner. "This is my husband," she said, her voice lively as Winston nodded politely and shook a few hands. Conversations flowed with laughter and toasts, but Winston, being more reserved, kept his words to a minimum. He noticed that Veronica's eyes seemed to scan the room more than once. "Looking for someone?" he asked, and she just shook her head with a smile. "No, just seeing who else showed up." Shortly afterward, Veronica introduced him to Clifford. Winston recognized the name. This was the funny colleague she occasionally mentioned. Clifford was charismatic, with an easygoing grin and a relaxed demeanor that seemed to captivate everyone around him. "So you finally brought the husband," Clifford joked, extending his hand. "We were starting to think he was a myth." Winston laughed politely, but there was something about Clifford that felt off. Maybe it was his carefree way of interacting with Veronica, or how his gaze lingered a bit more than Winston would have liked. Even so, Winston decided not to dwell on it. He didn't want to spoil the evening with baseless suspicions. As the party continued, Veronica and Clifford seemed to become closer. They shared inside jokes Winston didn't understand, laughed about stories he wasn't familiar with, and sometimes seemed caught up in their own private world. Winston tried to distract himself by talking to other guests and sampling the appetizers, but his attention kept returning to Veronica. He noticed how she leaned in slightly when talking to Clifford, how she casually touched his arm when she laughed, and how their glances lingered just a moment longer than they should. At one point, Veronica said she was going to the bathroom. Winston simply nodded, trying not to look uneasy, but he stayed alert. Several minutes passed, and she didn't return. Then he realized something else. Clifford had vanished, too. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut, and his heartbeat sped up. He tried telling himself it was a coincidence, but couldn't shake the sense that something was off. While waiting, Winston attempted to hide his discomfort, but his eyes continued scanning the room for any sign of Veronica or Clifford. When she finally came back, there was something different about her. Her hair looked slightly disheveled, her cheeks were flushed. He tried to blame it on the drinks or the party's excitement. Moments later, Clifford also appeared, wearing his usual carefree smile. Winston noticed they avoided direct eye contact, which only fueled his anxiety. He wanted to ask Veronica what had happened, but he knew it wasn't the right time or place. The party went on, but for Winston, everything felt warped. The music seemed distant, the laughter around him sounded muffled, and Veronica's smile, once a source of comfort, now seemed to hide secrets he was terrified to uncover. The feeling he'd been trying to ignore became undeniable, and a seed of doubt took root in his heart. That night, Winston could barely conceal his agitation. After dinner, Veronica said she was going to take a shower to relax before bedtime. He just nodded, staring at his empty plate, fighting the thoughts that tormented him. Winston paid attention to every detail, the times, the excuses, how Veronica always kept her phone close. His suspicion was eating at him, and he felt he was on the brink of discovering something that would change his life forever. The sound of running water filled the house while Winston stayed in the living room, staring at Veronica's phone on the table. It was unusual for her to leave it out of reach, which only heightened his unease. For months, he had resisted invading her privacy, even when his doubts consumed him. He believed respect and trust were the foundations of any relationship. But that night, his tension reached a breaking point. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone. It was locked, but he knew the passcode. It was once a significant date for them both. He hesitated, staring at the screen as if she could see him. He felt guilty and compelled at the same time, but he knew he couldn't ignore his gut any longer. As soon as he unlocked it, he went straight to the messages. At the top of the list was a familiar name, Clifford. Winston's heart pounded as he opened the conversation. He tried to prepare himself for what he might see, but nothing could cushion the blow of the messages he read. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow." "That moment at the party was incredible," wrote Clifford in a message sent the morning before. Veronica had replied, "Me too. It was risky, but it was worth it. See you tomorrow after work." Winston felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He kept scrolling, seeing messages so private and hidden that they made him feel sick. Veronica and Clifford had been secretly meeting for weeks, maybe even months. They mentioned times she claimed she was at work, dinners in out-of-the-way places, and even visits to his house. He put the phone back where he found it, as if he had never touched it, but the pain was overwhelming. He stayed there, unable to process what he had discovered. Every memory of Veronica, her smile, her plans, her closeness, now seemed stained by her betrayal. The sound of the shower turning off brought him back to reality. Soon Veronica came out of the bathroom, hair still damp, wrapped in a robe, appearing calm and oblivious to the storm about to strike. "You okay?" she asked, noticing how quiet he was. He just shook his head. "Yeah, just thinking about work." As much as he wanted to confront her then and there, Winston decided to wait. He needed to stay composed, even though he was falling apart inside. He went upstairs and lay down next to her, staring at the ceiling while Veronica fell asleep almost instantly. The difference between her tranquility and the turmoil inside him was nearly unbearable. The next morning, Winston made a decision: he wouldn't confront Veronica right away. He wanted something more tangible, proof so undeniable that she'd be forced to admit everything. So he contacted a private investigator, giving a brief overview of the situation but emphasizing that he needed solid evidence. "I understand, sir," said the detective, Maurice, with a calm yet resolute tone. "We'll take care of it." While waiting for the investigation's results, Winston filed for divorce and went on with his daily routine. Every word Veronica spoke now felt tinged with irony. The feeling of being cheated on suffocated him, but he knew he had to endure just a little longer to confront her at the right moment. A few days later, Maurice got back to him with the proof Winston needed: photos, text messages, and logs of their meetups, all carefully documented. When Winston saw the evidence, he felt something inside him shatter beyond repair. He had feared this, guessed it, and secretly hoped he was mistaken. But now, there was no way to hide from the truth. He stared at the images with a blank expression, his heart splintered into countless pieces. Veronica and Clifford were photographed entering a motel and leaving hours later, smiling and touching in ways Winston hadn't experienced from Veronica in a long time. That night, he returned home with the divorce papers already prepared. He didn't need any more excuses or explanations. The truth was glaring and nothing could change what she had done. Veronica was still at work, and Winston used the quiet time to reflect. There would be no escape for her once she arrived. He wasn't sure exactly what he would say, but he knew it would be the end. When Veronica arrived, Winston was already seated at the dining table, the divorce documents laid out on the surface. The air felt heavy. She seemed surprised to see him so serious and still. "Are you all right?" Veronica asked, hanging her purse on the nearby chair. Her voice sounded casual, but Winston didn't answer immediately. He looked up slowly, letting her feel the gravity of his stare. "We need to talk," he said in a firm tone that made Veronica freeze for a moment. She studied him for a few seconds, sensing something was terribly wrong. About what? She asked, sitting across from him, a nervous grin that didn't reach her eyes. Winston didn't waste time. He pushed the divorce papers toward her along with the photos and messages the detective had gathered. Veronica frowned, confused, until her eyes fell on the proof. The silence that followed was deafening. Her expression shifted from shock to panic, then to remorse and desperation. "Winston, it's not what it looks like," she started to stammer, but he raised his hand for her to stop. "I don't want excuses, Veronica. I don't need explanations. I already know everything," he said, his voice quiet but loaded with suppressed emotion. "I trusted you. I poured my whole life into this marriage, and this is how you repay me?" Veronica remained silent, her face alternating between disbelief and shame. She knew she couldn't deny it, the evidence was conclusive. I made a mistake," she finally admitted, voice quivering. "It was a moment of weakness. I never meant to hurt you." Winston let out a hollow laugh, void of any warmth. "A moment of weakness?" He pointed to the photographs. "This isn't just a moment of weakness, Veronica. It's a choice, one you made over and over." Veronica tried to justify herself, but words no longer held any meaning for Winston. He had already made up his mind. He stood, his posture stiff but the pain clear in every movement. "I want you to sign these papers. I want this to be over right now. I have nothing more to say." She attempted to protest, appealing to the feelings that once held them together, but Winston stood firm. He knew that giving in would mean losing his self-respect, and he wasn't about to do that. Veronica signed the papers that very night, her hands shaking around the pen. When she finished, Winston gathered the documents, looked at her one last time, and said, "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." After Veronica left, taking only a suitcase of clothes, Winston was overcome by both relief and sorrow. The house felt oddly empty, but he knew he needed this space to rebuild. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. He had lost something dear, while Veronica and Clifford seemed to walk away unscathed. It wasn't just the end of the marriage that tore him apart, it was also the sense that those who betrayed him could go on as if nothing had happened. In the following weeks, Winston began to devise a plan. He had no intention of harming anyone physically, it went against his nature, but he wanted Clifford to face at least some repercussions for what he'd done. He recalled something Maurice had told him: Clifford had quite a reputation in the company, and it wasn't flawless. He was the type who maneuvered situations to his benefit, and his affair with Veronica wasn't the first rumor of wrongdoing. Winston put the evidence Maurice had gathered to use by sending the photos and messages, anonymously, to Clifford's HR department. He included a short note explaining how his behavior undermined the moral and professional environment of the team. He kept Veronica's name out of it, but made certain Clifford's actions would be scrutinized. The response was swift. Clifford was summoned for a meeting, and the news quickly spread among his co-workers. He tried to defend himself, but the proof was too strong to be dismissed. The company decided to fire him, citing behavior incompatible with its values. When Winston heard the update, he felt a wave of satisfaction and relief. It wasn't revenge in the harshest sense. Clifford had capitalized on people's trust and was now dealing with the consequences of his actions. Still, Winston refused to let this be the sole defining element of his future. He knew there was a long road ahead, demanding courage, patience, and personal growth. Yet, at least he felt he'd reclaimed some of his dignity, something no one could take away from him again. The next morning felt different. Sunlight streamed into Winston's home, illuminating the vacant spaces around him. Despite everything that had happened, he sensed something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not that the hurt had vanished, it still echoed in his chest, but for the first time in months, he had control over his own life. Veronica was gone, and with her went the weight of mistrust and betrayal. The house that once symbolized their marriage now represented a sign of a new beginning. Even so, the days that followed weren't easy. Winston confronted his solitude head-on, with no distractions or justifications. There were no more punishing work hours to excuse his emotional absence, nor were there hushed arguments with Veronica to fill the silence. It was just him, alone with his deepest emotions. At night, he often sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, letting the quiet that used to frighten him become something soothing. One day, while walking through a nearby park, Winston noticed a group of people gathered under a large canopy. Their voices were lively, interspersed with laughter, and there was an energy that stood in contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. Curious, he got closer and saw it was a volunteer effort, people distributing food and clothing to those in vulnerable situations. Winston paused for a moment, observing how everything worked. It was a simple setup, but every action carried a deeply human quality. An older man, who seemed to be in charge, caught sight of Winston and invited him to join. "We could always use more helping hands," he said with a warm smile. Winston hesitated briefly but decided to stay. He spent the afternoon handing out meals and talking to those who came for assistance. Each story he heard opened a window into another life, tales of resilience, loss, and the struggle to keep going. Even though he was there to help, he felt it was he who was being helped. By the end of the day, the coordinator thanked him and encouraged Winston to return whenever he liked. That evening, Winston realized something important: there's more to life than the pain we carry. The hurt was real, but it didn't need to last forever. He decided that rather than letting bitterness eat away at him, he would channel this energy into constructing something new and purposeful. A few weeks later, Winston was volunteering regularly with the group. He helped organize donations, chatted with people who needed support, and even began leading some small initiatives. During one of these events, he met Astrid, a teacher who also devoted her time to volunteer work. Astrid was compassionate, with a calm smile and a sincerity that immediately caught Winston's attention. They started talking, and soon these conversations turned into meetups beyond their volunteer hours. Astrid was nothing like Veronica, and Winston truly appreciated that. She was open, authentic, and shared the same core values he had always wanted in a relationship. Their bond grew slowly, without rushing, yet with a genuine connection. For the first time in a long while, Winston felt that he was genuinely rebuilding himself rather than just surviving. Though scarred by his past, he understood those marks didn't define him. They were reminders of a painful journey, but also of transformation and discovery. Winston knew he would never forget what had happened, but it didn't mean he had to carry that pain indefinitely. He chose to look forward, to see the new possibilities life placed before him. Months later, walking in the park with Astrid, he recalled a phrase he'd heard from someone who received help under the volunteer canopy: "Life can knock you down, but it also gives you the tools to get back up if you choose to use them." Winston smiled, realizing how much that resonated with him. He'd found not only a new reason to move on but also a new version of himself, stronger, more self-aware, and most importantly, at peace. His story wasn't solely about betrayal or loss, it was about redemption, about discovering a sense of purpose in the midst of pain, and about understanding that even during our darkest hardships, there's always a path forward. And that path, as frightening as it might seem, can lead to something far greater than we ever imagined. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.